Good evening. My name is Kay Salfaro. I work with Strangers No Longer, and I especially work in the area of education and learning what's going on at the southern border. So we really want to make sure that we are up to date, that we understand the complexities and the different situations that occur. It's important because in Strangers No Longer, we work with in at least two dimensions. Number one, with the individual, and number two, with the group, the organization, the culture. So individuals are very important to us. And as a matter of fact, right now I would like to introduce Rosemary Inslee, former chair of our board, who would like to share with you some information on our work with individual members. Rosemary?
Thank you, Kay. I appreciate that introduction. I'm Rosemary Inslee, a member of Strangers No Longer and a board representative from our Mother of Perpetual Help parish. We usually invite a member of Strangers No Longer from one of our 10 immigrant groups from across the state to share part of their story in all of our presentations. I regret that we're unable to do that this time because of the possible outcome of the coming election has again raised a lot of fear among them, fear of widespread deportation or reprisals for speaking out. Instead, I'd like to share with you part of the story of the development of the immigrant groups. As some of you may know, Strangers No Longer started in 2017 with a small group of people from parishes around the diocese, initiated by Bill O'Brien. One of the things that we did in the early days was kind of struggle with how can we support immigrants, particularly if we're not in touch with immigrants in our particular circles or parishes. A wonderful answer came a few years later in 2020 in the form of Sister Martha Della Torre, who is a Sister of Mary Reparatrix and was finishing her studies at U of D. She really wanted to work with Latino women and got connected with us. And after meeting with some families in crisis during the pandemic, she agreed to work with us and develop circles of support among immigrant women under the auspices of Strangers No Longer. Sister Martha started with a small group of women who began sharing their stories with each other. They did it mostly on Zoom because it was during the pandemic, and so felt safe in their own homes. And then after meeting for several months, Sister Martha challenged that small group to invite 2 or 3 friends to join the group. And so that was the beginning of the variety of immigrant women's groups. We now have one men's group started at St. Andre Bessette, which is wonderful. So they found strength and support in their spirituality and in their practical challenges. According to Sister Martha, in these spaces, we feel confident to talk about our experiences, pray together, and look for options to help each other to improve difficult situations. Eventually, Sister Martha was able to broaden her work geographically to develop circles in Traverse City, Holland, and Ionia, as well as Detroit, Downriver, Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti, Ann Arbor, Pontiac, and Westland. Amy Kettner, another staff member, was also part of some of that development. As time went on, the group shared more commonly and more openly wounds from having to leave their country and family under often harrowing conditions, then undergoing the dangerous journey to this country and the tenuous existence in the U.S. Because of the very narrow criteria for getting refugee status through asylum. That's available to a very specific and small number of people. In a 4th of July Global Sisters Report article in the National Catholic Reporter, Sister Martha was interviewed about her work. and why these circles of support are important. And here is her response. The situation experienced by hundreds of women and men here is not easy at all. Many of them feel unsafe in the face of a culture totally different from their own, and in some cases facing a society that rejects and excludes them. These brothers and sisters are gradually going through an adaptation process. It involves many things, such as lack of income, extreme climate, distance from family, and lack of access to basic services. It's a process that's made more complicated when people are and feel alone. At Strangers No Longer, we seek to help them feel God's closeness through our support actions. We offer spaces for personal and spiritual growth so they can discover their own leadership. As a result of this work, immigrant representatives now form half of the board of directors and officers of Strangers No Longer. They have a leadership group that's now stepping into circle leadership also. These circles have become vital partners with circle leaders in parishes, which is what makes Strangers No Longer a unique effort. While many members are still in the shadows, they provided invaluable feedback about the issues that most affect their lives, such as not being able to obtain a driver's license, being vulnerable to workplace abuses, such as not being paid for the number of hours worked or at the rate that they were promised, and landlord abuses, such as not making needed repairs in homes and apartments that affect health and safety. Strangers No Longer is advocating for the passage of the Drive Safe bill package currently in committee, which would reinstate the ability of all Michigan residents, no matter what their immigration status, to obtain a driver's license. Our efforts are a direct result of the voices of the immigrant circles of support, who continue to be partners in the work of humane reception into the United States. I wish this could have been a story from an individual, because it's our stories that put us in touch with how we're connected to each other. But if we who have legal status need for now to be the voices of who so desire to find a way of life and work for their families, but find themselves in the shadows, then here we are.
Thank you, Rosemary. This work is some of the most important work our organization does. So we work from two perspectives: the individual, the value of the dignity of each person, and we also work with the larger cultures. And so I thank you for sharing that. It's so impressive. During this evening session, what we're really going to also focus on, though, is the big picture. What's happening at the border? What are the good things and what are the things that are working and those that are not? And so with that, I'm just absolutely delighted to introduce you to Mr. Dylan Corbett. I welcome him from El Paso, where he's the executive director of the Hope Border Institute. Dylan brings extensive knowledge and background in issues international and human development globally. And this is a worldwide concern. We deal with South America, but people from all over the world are being forced in different ways to leave their homeland and move to safer places where there's an opportunity for them and their children. So with that, I would like to also comment that Dylan brings 15 years of hands-on, out in the field work in El Paso with his Hope Border Institute. He's with us tonight to share the current situation at the U.S. southern border and the hope that we might have. So with that, Dylan, welcome. Would you like to tell us about yourself to begin with and life in El Paso?
Sure. Just confirming that you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Kay. Thanks for the introduction. It's a real privilege for me to be with y'all this evening. The mission of Strangers No Longer really, really resonates with me. And there's a lot of similarities with the work that we do here in El Paso, but I love how you bring together the humanitarian element, helping people directly, the direct service, with the advocacy and the education. I think that's powerful. And it's something that we strive to do here in El Paso. So just a wonderful privilege to be with you. And happy to talk about the border tonight. It's a topic, obviously, that has been in the news for a long time now. The issue and the reality of immigration hits our country in many different ways, but one of the focal points, of course, is the border, and so it's important for us as people on the border, as a border community, to be able to have opportunities to project the truth about what's happening on the border. So. Just thrilled by this invitation to be able to talk to you. To answer your question about El Paso and the community here, I think it's important to recognize that the border is, it's a complex reality. It's a human reality. The border's long. It's 2,000 miles, and so there are communities like El Paso, east to west along the length of the whole border. And many of the communities are dynamic. They're big, like El Paso. El Paso, we sit astride a sister city in Mexico. So just across the border, if I look out my front door in the morning, I can see our sister community of Ciudad Juarez just across the border. And so if you add up the population of our community in El Paso with our sister community in Juarez, and then actually we have another border with New Mexico, and there's a small town just across the New Mexico line called Las Cruces. If you add it all up, we've actually got about 2.5 million residents in the area. So it's a pretty big, substantial, dynamic community. And we've been around for a long time. The binational community has been here, before there was the United States of America. We're in Texas, but we were here before there was a Republic of Texas. Remember, the Texas was a country before it became part of the United States. We were here before Mexico. There were people passing through here, indigenous communities passing through here for thousands of years before the arrival of Europeans to the area. So we've got migration in our blood. It's in our DNA. It's in our veins. This has been a place of transit, people going north and south, people selling goods for hundreds of years, for centuries. So we know a little bit of migration because of that. Even the name El Paso in Spanish, of course, it means the passage or the pathway. And that's exactly what we are. We're a community that knows migration deeply. About 1/4 of our population is foreign born. We're 82% Mexican American. Many of us are bilingual. We speak English and Spanish. So migration is is something that comes naturally to us. 35,000 people every day across the border coming north from Ciudad Juarez. Our economies are interconnected. If you were to go to our shopping malls, or really shopping centers on either side of the border, you'd find license plates from Mexico or license plates in Mexico from the United States, because our economies are so interconnected. Mexico is the United States' largest trading partner. So there's a lot of import-export that goes through here. 17% of all trade between our two countries actually goes through El Paso. So that's about $145 billion every year. So it's a vibrant community. It's a big community. We're the cowboy boot capital of the world as well. If you want cowboy boots, you can come down here and buy some. We sell more per capita than any other city in the country. But migration is a reality that we know pretty well.
I understand, though you talk about, because you talk about the 35,000 people, I found that you told me that you have 5 different entry points or bridges coming across.
Yeah. So the ports of entry, we have several, along the length and breadth of our city. There are several ports of entry. Because people are coming. First of all, you have that commerce, so those billions of dollars that I mentioned in trade that are going forth back and forth every day. You have a lot of trucks that are transporting those goods. So there are goods that I imagine end up in Michigan, that probably went through Juarez or came through El Paso. Not only goods that are coming north, but a lot of the goods from Asia too. They'll come here on the train from California, from Long Beach in California, and then they'll go to other parts of the country. So I bet, maybe the computers that you're using this evening probably passed through El Paso. And then people cross for other reasons too. Students, for example, Strangers No Longer, you're Catholic organizations, and there's a long history of Catholic schools up in Detroit. Our Catholic schools, everyone's struggling with Catholic schools, right? But our Catholic schools would probably close tomorrow if students from Juarez couldn't cross the border every day to come to our Catholic schools, because many of the kids who go to our Catholic schools actually come from Ciudad Juarez. Our state university, a large number of the students who study at our state university here in El Paso, they also come from Juarez. So people, they cross to study, they cross to shop, they cross to visit family. Families have roots on both sides of the border. It's very typical, very common for people here in this community. So they'll go back and forth, to celebrate, to go to baptisms, confirmations, quinceañeras, birthday parties. People are all, those crossings are happening every day, because we share culture, we share food, we share family, and we share faith.
So what percentage of people would you say who come in are able to stay?
It's an interesting curiosity. Many folks may not know this, that many people, there's actually a special visa for border communities. So many people in Juarez are able to have a special visa. It's called informally a laser visa. And actually they're able to come to El Paso. They're not allowed to cross to points north of us, but they're allowed to come over to El Paso if they want to shop or if they want to visit with family. There's actually a special visa for border communities. I find that a lot of folks in the interior of the country, they think that the border is this sort of binary reality that's sealed off, to everything south. But it's not like that. It's a fluid reality. It's a human reality. There's a lot of history. As I said, our communities were here before either country existed. And so the reality is quite fluid. But you also see the reality of immigration enforcement. So as I said, many of those people, with laser visas, they aren't able to travel north, and there's a reason for that, because we have border patrol checkpoints. So something that I don't know if you have in Detroit, but if you were to go in your vehicle east, west, or north of El Paso, very quickly on the highways, you'd be stopped at a border patrol checkpoint. So we have the reality also of immigration enforcement and everything that comes with that, all the complications and the complexities that come with that as well.
So the Border Patrol is at the border and then at the borders of the city of El Paso as well. Interesting, very
That's right.
interesting.
Yeah, Border Patrol actually has the authority to patrol the 100 miles from the border into the interior, and so their presence extends quite far.
Very good. Now, as I listen to you, it sounds like you're saying without the words, you're saying that things are going well. So can you talk about the things that are really working, that are going well for you, for the city of, or for El Paso, and where your organization kind of fits in?
Yeah, immigration is a challenge, no doubt, and you all know that in your own state, because of it's a human reality. People are in need. People are, when they come to the border, they're often in a very vulnerable state. And then of course the complexity of our legal system adds to the challenges and the difficulties. But I think El Paso is a special place. We're right sort of in the center of the border, all the way in West Texas. And so we've long been a main corridor for migration for folks coming north. maybe from Mexico, maybe from Central America. And there are migrants now from all around the world, South America, Africa, Asia, who also come to countries south of our border, and then they'll make their way up north to the U.S.-Mexico border, many of them coming through El Paso, Texas. And so there's a lot of challenges that come with that. But El Paso has a long tradition, very long tradition of hospitality. And a lot of that tradition also has to do with organizations of faith. Catholic organizations, Christian organizations have really been at the forefront in our community for decades, if not longer, of providing a humane, a dignified, compassionate welcome to people. We also have a strong tradition in this community of community organizing. And so there's an ecosystem of nonprofits and churches and civic leaders and faith leaders who have come together over the years to really make sure that there is that dignified welcome, and work with the U.S. government, work with our local governments in order to make that happen too. So over the years, despite the challenges, we've been able to rise to the occasion in many respects. Again, not to minimize the real challenges that are there, but this is a community that is able to pull together, put resources together, and provide a dignified welcome for those who are able to access protection here at the border, those who are seeking asylum, and other types of vulnerable migrants. That work of hospitality happens every day, every day.
What do you mean by that? With volunteers, or how do it happen?
Over the years and decades, it's largely been volunteer driven. In recent years, under the Biden administration, and then previously under the Trump administration, the federal government has also begun to put resources into this work of hospitality in a way that never really happened before. So our local governments have been able to draw down those resources. Some NGOs have been able to draw down those resources. And when people are processed into the United States through Border Patrol, they'll be released to that NGO community or the ecosystem of churches that provide hospitality to folks. And it's a pretty seamless transition. Most people, I think, in the interior of the country probably would not be aware that our group of NGOs and nonprofits, we work very, very collaboratively with our law enforcement, immigration enforcement partners to provide a dignified welcome to those who are processed into the country. Again, it doesn't come without its challenges. There are difficulties, but we've been able to work over the years to make sure that collaboration takes place on a local level. And as I said, the federal government is now much more engaged and involved than it has been in the past in resourcing that effort. And so there's a lot of solutions here in El Paso that we've been able to put into practice, which I think if you scaled up would work in other communities across the border. And there's some lessons learned for communities in the interior as well.
Right. Now, so it sounds good that you're getting more federal funding and federal support. That's really quite amazing. Can you say anything? There was quite a buzz a while ago about a Catholic organization that was being shut down by Governor Abbott. When we've been saying let the charities, let the NGOs do the work, and now that just was stunning. Is there anything you can say to address that? I believe it was a Jesuit nonprofit.
Yeah. A lot of the challenges with immigration take place on the state level. I think you mentioned at the top of the call, Rosemary mentioned that you all are trying to advance some good legislation on the driver's license.
Yes.
Well, immigration's a big state issue here in Texas. And unfortunately, our political leadership in the state have really, really doubled down on an anti-immigrant politics, a politics of exclusion. And that's come across in many, many ways. We have some pretty bad laws that were passed recently that attempt to criminalize migration. We also have the deployment of the National Guard and state troopers to the border, and they've erected their own border walls, and they're engaged every day also in immigration enforcement right at the border, which is very problematic and very concerning, and has resulted in some real serious and grave humanitarian situations. But unfortunately, the state has not been content just to go after immigrants. Now they're also targeting people who help immigrants. And so here in El Paso, one of our largest and one of the groups that's been around really the longest, Annunciation House, which is a Catholic organization, which
Right.
we work with the Catholic diocese work with, many parishes work with, Christian churches work with, and faith organizations of other faiths. They went after them to try to shut them down, and they made some pretty specious allegations about their work, calling their hospitality work smuggling and shading into trafficking, and just launching some really provocative and incendiary accusations that are false. Today, actually, there was some news on that front because recently the courts called a spade and said that what they were trying to do was just plain wrong. But they're now appealing. They're going to try to appeal to the Texas Supreme Court. So the governor and the attorney general are going all the way to try to criminalize this type of work. It's important to say, though, that unfortunately, Annunciation House in El Paso aren't the only group that have been targeted by the attorney general. They're also going after Catholic Charities. You mentioned Sister Norma a little bit earlier.
Yes, on the eastern side of Texas. Yes,
she's in South Texas.
South.
Yeah, they've gone after Sister Norma and Catholic Charities in South Texas as well. So it's not just limited to El Paso, but the idea is that they're really ratcheting up this campaign, which is really dehumanizing and really represents the worst of Texas. I mean, this is not who we are as a state. They're just leaning into this really discriminatory and xenophobic politics. But it's not just an attack on migrants. Now they're trying to attack people who support migrants, and that's quite unfortunate.
Well, you've kind of really begun to speak now a little bit more about, so what, talk to us first about your organization, and then I would like to go into what's not going well. So what is your organization? What kind of work do you do? Please.
Yeah, we do research on the effects of immigration policy on our community, and on those who are passing through our community, vulnerable migrants. So we look at the effects of what are the policies around immigration and how do they impact actual people. And then we do advocacy around that. We advocate for safe, effective, humane ways for people to migrate, ways that work for our border community, that work for our country, that work for those who migrate. And we also provide, just as you all offer direct service, we also do direct service as well in the form of humanitarian aid. So there are a lot of people in Ciudad Juarez, our sister city, who are either waiting there in order for a chance to access legal pathways into the United States, and they need assistance, so shelter or medical support, psychological support. We also have provided, right now we don't need to do this right now because the situation is pretty stable in El Paso, but we provided hospitality in El Paso, working with our Catholic community to open up shelter. And then currently, one of the things we are doing in El Paso that unfortunately we have to do is providing humanitarian support in the desert, because there's so many people who are crossing the desert and dying right now. So providing water drops and medical care to people crossing.
So you're working on both sides of the border.
Yeah, our work is binational. We work in El Paso, we work in Ciudad Juarez, which I think reflects our community as a binational community. But most of our humanitarian work at this point is in Ciudad Juarez.
Thank you. So now I'd like to move into, you've spoken about many of the things that have been going really well within your community, the community organization, the dignity that people in your community try to extend to those coming into this country, and a number of things. So what's not going well? Where do we need things to get better? We all know that things are not going well at the border. I mean, that's the story we hear. The crisis.
Yeah, I think unfortunately, the reality is just that the border's been so politicized, just so politicized, and so it's unfortunate to break through sometimes the politics of it. But for us, we turn to the reality of the human reality, the reality of people who are suffering. I mentioned, for example, the deaths. Right now in El Paso, we have, unfortunately, the largest number of deaths that we've ever seen. The deaths have skyrocketed in recent years. So we have hundreds of people dying in our desert, hundreds of people who are dying because they are trying to cross the river, and they end up drowning. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, I mentioned what Texas is doing. Unfortunately, in the last couple of years, Texas has come in and built additional border wall. They've deployed their soldiers to engage in immigration enforcement, and that's pushing people into the river, and that's pushing people into the desert, where it's much more difficult and dangerous to cross. The policies also that are in place. The policies are not clear. They're applied unevenly, and not always rationally. But remember, we do have two Biden administration asylum bans in place, one which was put into place last year, another which was just recently put into place a couple weeks ago. And so there are a lot of people who are in need of protection that are not able to access that. And so they also will attempt to cross in more dangerous parts of the border, or they'll get funneled into to kidnapping, trafficking in Ciudad Juarez. The government of Mexico is also cracking down on migrants in Ciudad Juarez under pressure from the US government. So there are a lot of human rights abuses that are taking place because of that. So there's a lot of pain. There's a lot of pain points that are different. And it's because of our broken immigration policies. It's because of what Texas is doing. It's complicated. Unfortunately, it's a very complex reality. But basically, for a lot of people, the system just doesn't work. There are a lot of people who need to migrate, and the system isn't working for them. And there's a lot of human damage and fallout that comes from that.
So when we began to talk, where things are going well, we talked about the bridges and people coming through those entry points. So how big is the problem where people are coming through other areas?
Yeah, it's quite significant. The numbers of migrants coming to the border have been quite high in recent years.
Can you give me some numbers?
Yeah, we've reached the 1 million point
A day?
in recent years. On an annual basis throughout the whole U.S.-Mexico border.
Yes.
And when you hit that point, that's pretty high. So we're not at the highest levels. Around the time of the turn of the century was probably when we had our highest levels, but we're certainly approaching those levels. So nothing to sneeze at. The reality is, though, that you remember, we haven't reformed our immigration laws since 1996. Our immigration laws are imperfect. They're not working
Right.
in the way that, they're just not working for the current realities that we have right now. And the reality is that our immigration laws are laboring under two sort of impulses that we have as a country. On the one hand, we're a country that does a lot to welcome and to immigrate migrants. Migrants have been so beneficial to who we are as a country. They contribute socially and economically to our vibrancy, to our diversity, our resilience as a country. And that's true here of Texas, and it's true of El Paso. We have a humanitarian impulse too to welcome people. We help a lot of refugees who are affected by the reality of conflict and war throughout the world. On the other hand, we have this sort of bipolar relationship with immigration as a country. We want to keep a lot of people out, and we want to put in place some pretty aggressive policies to make that happen. So what happens at the border is we labor under both of those things. And some administrations, they lean really aggressively into the enforcement, and others, they may moderate it a little bit. But really, unfortunately, at the end of the day, the only coherent strategy that we have in the absence of a, immigration reform, it's really just a strategy of pain. And so the U.S. government, controls and moderates immigration at the border, just through pain. Some administrations turn that dial of pain up really high. Things like family separation, things like detention, things like deportation. Some moderate it a bit, and so they'll open up the window of aperture to allow more people to access protection. But it's really the same dial. And so we need to get to a place where we can really overhaul the system and reform it, because right now we're laboring under those two dynamics. And at the border, an administration, might change its strategy on a daily basis, and that often happens here in El Paso. Washington might have a different policy, one day, one policy one day, and a different policy another day. And then you layer onto that reality that in the absence of the reform, states are taking immigration policy into their own hands, like Texas. And then, you can see how complicated it can be. But it results in a lot of pain for people, a lot of death, a lot of death, a lot of
And
pain.
we're talking deaths in Mexico and in the desert.
That's correct. Yeah, a lot of death.
Right.
My team, unfortunately, we've found dead bodies in the desert. We have a medical team of doctors that has helped people that have been families that have been shot at with rubber bullets and tear gas canisters by the Texas National Guard, who have been pushed into barbed wire and concertina wire. So a lot of pain. For a lot of folks, I think this is a political question, or it's a question of right and left, or conservative or liberal, or if we just get the right incentives in place, then we can fix this. For here on the border, there's just a lot of human pain. You see the human damage on a daily basis that the lack of a strong, robust system and laws that make sense ought to provide.
So even though we've talked about the things that are going well, your community really is very aware of that pain and the need for human solutions,
Yeah,
humane solutions.
I think we can be proud of communities like El Paso because in spite of the challenges, the complexities, in spite of the political realities, so much of this is just driven by politics, frankly. We've been able to pull together and meet a lot of the human need. We're a resilient community. We're a resourceful community. We're a community that's really motivated by our faith, that understands that, helping those in need is transformative work. It makes you better. It makes you a better community. But we do labor under some really difficult conditions. We labor under politicians, our highest officials in the state of Texas, who want to target us for this type of work and who threaten us with lawsuits and criminalization. So you can't minimize the challenges, but even despite all that, I think we owe our border communities a word of thanks, because there's so much good work that's done by ordinary people, just ordinary people in the pews, oftentimes, who, are making sandwiches for migrants, or are going out into the desert and dropping off some water, or, doctors and medical professionals who give of their time to serve as volunteers to help people.
Are Biden's 2 executive orders, can you speak to them a bit? Are they helping? The first one was pretty scary, but
yeah, no, they're not. So where do the executive orders come from? You'll remember that we had a health order. Remember, we went through the pandemic. So what happened
yes,
under the previous administration is something called Title 42 is put into place.
and that's gone.
Yeah, I think it was May 2020. So it ended in May 2023. So about 3 years we had that in place. And following that basically gave the government the ability to ignore asylum law and just deport whoever we wanted to deport, irrespective of what what the law was. Just because of the pandemic, we could just suspend asylum law. The Biden administration said, okay, we're gonna get rid of that, but we're gonna put into place something that allows us to kind of keep deporting whoever or removing whoever we want to remove, even still, by saying that we putting some really onerous conditions on people who are coming to the border. It was a messaging policy meant to kind of, again, a lot of these things are observed sometimes more in the breach than in reality. And so some days it's observed by Border Patrol, some days it's not observed. It's kind of a mixed reality, again, because things are so complicated. And then recently, in the last couple of weeks, we've had another order, which in some ways says the same thing as the first order, that there's an asylum ban. But again, its application is mixed. There are more deportations, certainly. A lot of families are being removed. There's intense collaboration with Mexico. That was the order was one thing. What was unsaid was that we were going to work with Mexico to make this happen. So a lot
Is that
of
working?
the numbers the numbers of people coming to the border have gone down, because I think that the US, no, I know that what's happened is the US is really found an effective way to limit migration by working really hard with Mexico. So we're collaborating a lot with Mexico, and they're basically taking our approach at the border, an approach of pain, to detain people, to arrest people, to put them in detention, to bus them to other parts of the Mexico, to confuse them, to funnel them into the hands of smugglers and traffickers. That's why I say there's so much pain that's a result of this policy. But we're really leaning into that type of collaboration with Mexico. In fact, we've expanded it. So in the last week, if you've paid attention to the news on these issues, you've seen that we also have expanded now our collaboration with Panama. So a lot of people are coming through Central America, through Panama. Most of those people are coming from places like Venezuela and South America or Ecuador.
Right.
So now the U.S. government has kind of learned its lesson. This, we can work with other countries to stop migrants. So we're doing it with Mexico, and now we're moving to Panama. So that strategy of pain, unfortunately, we're moving it southward. Now it's not just Mexico. Now it's the Darien Gap in Panama.
Oh, that's right. They're talking about closing off that whole Darien Gap
Yeah.
area. Yeah, I heard that. Well, all right. So moving along. So as I hear you, so there is a crisis at the border, and what would you say the crisis is? The numbers of people coming? Evil guards? I mean, what is the crisis?
I think ultimately, we've proven, a community like El Paso, we've proven that we can receive people even when the numbers are high. We're able to pull together and provide the support that people need when they do come. So yeah, the numbers are high, but we're not overwhelmed as a community. There's not a lack of compassion. I think it's ultimately just a crisis of imagination. It's a crisis of imagination. It's a crisis of compassion on our country, on the part of our country.
By whom? By whom?
I think, again, as a country, unfortunately, we haven't arrived at the consensus that this will be our policy at the border. Migration has evolved.
Yes,
What we're seeing
yes.
at the border is these are really this is the latest generation of newcomers, of new Americans. But there are many people who would persuade us that we have to be afraid of this, that for some reason migration represents a threat to our country, or a threat to our jobs, or a threat to our communities. Because unfortunately, that message has political purchase across the country. And so it's a crisis of imagination in that sense, that we view the other, we view the person who's coming, we view the vulnerable person who's just looking for compassion as threat. We other that person. We see them as threat, and we build policies around that. We build political options around that.
To protect us from them.
Yeah, and there's a lot of scapegoating that takes place too. Unfortunately, in our country, we've seen over and over again that we've scapegoated migrants for our social ills. And we've seen that in El Paso. El Paso, I talked about us as the passage. President Lincoln, when he had a dream that he wanted to connect the East and West coasts. So he built the railroad. President Lincoln built the railroad. And the easiest way to build the railroad is through El Paso, because here we're at the southern tip of the Rocky Mountains. And then in Mexico, you have another mountain range. But here in El Paso, it opens up just a little bit So actually, this is the place where they chose to build the railroad that connected the east and the west coast, the two oceans. Who built the railroad in the 1800s? It was Asian migrants, people from China.
Of course.
And then
People,
when
and then we sent them home, right?
yeah, when they finished building the railroad, then we passed our first anti-immigrant laws, and we said, nope, we don't want you anymore. A lot of people here in El Paso, they're sons and daughters or grandchildren of people who are braceros. And the braceros were people who we invited in from Mexico when we were at war during the Second World War, because all the men were at war and the women were helping the military effort too. And so we needed a workforce in the fields and in the factories. And so we invited a lot of Mexican labor in. When the war ended, we were like, nope. And so we had Operation Wetback under President Eisenhower, which was even to date, the largest historical deportation we've ever had. So we have this, again, this sort of bipolar relationship with immigration as a country where we open the door, but then we slam it tight. And it just happens over and over again. And we have to really build some policy that respects the contributions of migrants, that they made us a better country, that's consistent with our better angels. Because again, when we do well, we do immigration well as a country, and we are able to integrate. We are able to allow people to contribute. You know, how many immigrants, are in our armed forces, are essential workers,
Right.
building our homes and getting our groceries and food on the table. So when we're able to do it, but we've got to come to some consensus at the country. The border is just the flashpoint. This is where it becomes most visible and most dramatic. But we need to come to consensus as a country about the type of country that we want to be. But I think we need to respect our identity as a country that has benefited so immensely from immigration, and recognize that these aren't people we need to fear. They're just the next generation of Americans and newcomers.
Right. Before we have a number of questions, people have put them in the chat. But before we go there, so what is the solution? I think I've heard you say it. Certainly government providing the way they are beginning to right now, providing for the care of these people, to recognize their dignity, and the welcoming buildings and areas that we need to service them as they come. And you've talked about the need for community of those people here. Okay, so what else do we need?
I think first we need to recognize that migration is a fact of life across our, across, not just in our country. The immigration that we're seeing at the border, it's just part of a broader phenomenon. When we started counting how many immigrants there were, it was around the Second World War. And so because the Second World War was a time of great displacement, so we started counting. And it's true, today we have more immigrants than at any other time in human history, perhaps. 120 million vulnerable people around the world have fled because of conflict or poverty or violence or persecution. But it's about 3% of the global population. So at the time of the Second World War, it was about 3% of the global population. Today, it's about 3.5% of the global population. So we have to recognize that migration is a fact of life, unfortunately, in our globalized world. And we have to put in place policies that work. We've tried border walls. We've tried enforcement. We have about 800 miles now border wall. If you came here to El Paso, you'd see the wall in triple in certain places. We've got about 18,000 Border Patrol agents on the southern border. We spend about $24 billion on immigration enforcement as a country, which is more than we spend on all other law enforcement combined, including FBI, Secret Service, U.S. Marshals, all other federal law enforcement. It doesn't work. It hasn't made a dent in global migration. It hasn't made a dent in migration to the border. So we need a different approach. And ultimately, we have to put in place legal pathways. So people who need to migrate, there need to be legal pathways for them to do so. We need to legalize it. The best way to deal with immigration is at the border is to legalize it. So let's find legal pathways, legal channels, so that people who need to migrate are able to access the protection that they need. And as a country, we can benefit from that. We can make sure that we can, for example, match our workforce needs to the population that's arriving. We need a flexible system like that. So I think change in mentality, recognize that immigration is part of the fabric of our global world today. Laws that benefit migrants, benefit migrant border communities, and benefit our country by making migration legal. And then ultimately, of course, you need to deal with the drivers. We need to fix the problems in countries of origin, because people have a right not to migrate. What I found working with people at the border here is that nobody wants to migrate. Migration is a choice of last resort for a lot of people.
Right. It's forced upon them. Yes. Yes.
So let's
Yes.
work to make sure that the right not to migrate is a reality for people in their home countries. That's long-term work, of course. But as a leader in the global community, I think the United States has a role in making that happen.
I thank you thus far, but we do have questions. And as I look at the clock, I can see powers that be. Can we go a few minutes past 8, everybody? Rich?
I'd say, yeah, let's go like 10 minutes with questions. How's that?
Very good. And do you have some of the questions from the chat, Rich?
Yeah, so one question that came in was, what are the conditions like for the folks who can't come across the border, who are stuck in Mexico, who have migrated but are still in Mexico? What's that world like? Who've
Yeah.
left their homes?
Yeah, the Trump administration really began this dynamic of trying to sort of outsource our responsibilities on migration to Mexico. So pushing, you probably heard of Remain in Mexico, and then I mentioned Title 42.
Yes.
And now these 2 executive orders. The intent is force people to stay over there. The reality is that Mexico just doesn't have the infrastructure, unfortunately, to be able to meet the human needs that people have, whether it's shelter, whether it's medical needs. If people have families and they're over there longer term, children have more complex needs. They need for education. Mexico is increasing the amount of people that it's providing asylum to. That's true. So a lot of people who are unable to find protection here in the United States have been able to find a place to be able to get asylum in Mexico. It's a small number, though. It's a small number, and it's a drop in the bucket compared to the reality of the need. The other thing is we're receiving a lot of people from Mexico at the border. Mexico, there was a time about 10, 15 years ago when Mexican migration was there was none. It was negligible. And in fact, there was a few years during the Obama administration when it was negative. Either more people were returning or deported than were coming. Now that's no longer true, because in large part because Mexico is just so unsafe. Mexico in many, in many respects is a narco state, is controlled by cartels and the reality of shipping drugs to the United States. And that has weakened its democracy, weakened its institutions. And it also means that migrants are very, very, very vulnerable in Mexico. So they're exploited a lot. They're killed, they're kidnapped, they are, exploited in many different ways. Mexico is an extremely dangerous place if you're a migrant, unfortunately, today. Ciudad Juarez is a very dangerous place for migrants. So policies that force migrants to stay in Mexico, they exacerbate that vulnerability for people, unfortunately.
Another question just came in. When you say we need legal pathways for immigrants, do you mean citizenship, or do you mean some type of permanent presence with work authorization?
Yeah, I think for the 11, 12 million people in our country right now without documents, we have a duty to offer them a pathway to citizenship, because that's the way that people participate fully, economically, socially. And these are people who are participating. I think, I just think about the experience of the pandemic and the people who kept it, the majority, so many of the essential workers were were the ones who kept our country healthy and resilient, and kept our economy going. And there's a sense of social responsibility that I think we have to reckon with there. But citizenship just means the ability to participate fully. So I think for those 11 and 12 million people, we definitely need to figure out a way to get them on the path to citizenship. For those for our economic needs, we have a lot of economic needs for people to access our labor market. So I think we need to figure out labor visas. We need to expand the amount of labor visas that we're providing. One of the things that got us to that point where we lowered significantly Mexican immigration, there were many things, but one of the significant factors was actually that we gave a lot of work visas, agricultural visas, and other types of work visas to Mexico. And that stabilized, there weren't as many people seeking to come into the United States irregularly because there were legal pathways for them to do so. I think for many of the Central Americans, for example, that are coming to our country right now, we need to figure out ways to increase the amount of labor visas. So I think it's a mix of things. Citizenship is part of it. It's one of those things that we need to do for those who have made this country their home and who are participating. But there are other people who perhaps would prefer circular migration, to come, contribute, make a living, and then return to their country. As a border community, we know that reality really well because as the border has hardened, and we've seen that in El Paso, the border's getting longer and higher, and there are more border agents. People they literally cannot go back anymore. So the undocumented population is trapped. So whereas before that, it was a more fluid reality where people made money here, maybe they worked in the fields, then they went home, they were doing seasonal work, or they came here and then they were sending back money to home to build a home, to construct a house, and then they would go back for their retirement. It's just not a reality anymore because we built a system that basically has trapped our undocumented population here, because if they leave, they're at risk of never being able to come back again.
Okay, Kay, I'll give you one more question. I think Dylan's done a good job answering a lot of the ones in the chat, but can you speak to some of the causes of the violence and danger in Mexico?
Yeah, I think you just can't underestimate in any way the reality of narco violence. It's so insidious because it's such a profitable industry, because as a country we consume so much drugs that it corrupts institutions. And not just Mexican institutions. If you look at institutions like our own border enforcement, unfortunately, the statistics bear this out. Border Patrol and immigration enforcement agents commit crimes at a higher rate than migrants. Part of that is because they're vulnerable to corruption too, because cartels, they'll look for bent officials in order to smuggle people or traffic goods or people. It's a very lucrative industry. If you came to El Paso, you'd notice that here we have many gun shops. The largest concentration of gun shops in our country is actually along the U.S.-Mexico border, because we have so many guns that are purchased here in the United States and that go south into Mexico. So we pay for the drugs, that money pays for the guns. The guns go to Mexico, drugs come north, guns go south. And the cartels fight each other for control of the trade routes. They buy off local officials. They weaken democracy. They weaken the courts. They weaken institutions. It creates a system. It creates an environment. That it affects everything. It just permeates every dimension of life. Young people who don't have economic opportunities or possibilities, they may be recruited to go into become part of criminal organizations. So it just infects every dimension of society, and it breeds insecurity. And when people can't work because it's not safe, they can't get a job because it's not safe, they can't raise a family because it's not safe, they're forced to migrate. And a lot of people in Mexico are living in that situation. And these criminal organizations, they don't just focus on drugs. Their purview expands. And immigration, unfortunately, immigrants are part of that. So they'll charge migrants as they come north. You know, they tax them and tax them and tax them and tax them and tax them. And then when they don't have any money anymore, they'll force them to call their relatives in the United States or back in their home countries, and they'll force them to pay additional taxes. And if they don't, they'll kidnap them, and at worst, you know, they'll take their lives. So it's just an insidious thing. And a lot of it, you know, we're responsible, we're involved in the issue, because as Americans, we're consumers, we're the final consumers of that product, unfortunately. So we've got to find a better way to deal with the reality of drugs as a country, because we're feeding a lot of that insecurity that unfortunately is driving migration for too many people.
Thanks, Dylan. Back to you, Kay.
All right, thank you very much. And you know, Dylan, when we were chatting I was getting to know your background on that, you talked about the importance of voting and thinking beyond your vote. Could you just speak to that for a minute?
Yeah, I think first of all, political participation is super important. Our elected officials need to hear us. They need to hear, you know, as I said, in the absence of immigration reform, there's a lot of voices in the public space who are, you know, who are taking advantage of, you know, the absence of good policy, and trying to persuade us again that we need to be afraid of migrants, and they're ginning up a lot of votes. And you know, so unfortunately, a politics of xenophobia has you know, a certain purchase in our country right now. So we need to speak up. We need to let our elected officials know that this is inconsistent with our values as who we are as Americans, as who we are as people of faith. And we also need to begin to knit together the future that we want. And that's what I think most impresses me about Strangers No Longer, because you know, through the direct service, through the circles that you're creating in your faith communities, you are giving life to a different vision. You know, you're putting into practice, this is the future that we want. This is the welcoming, compassionate, humane society that we can have, and putting into practice. And I think that's an act ultimately of resistance. Your vote is an act of resistance, but our compassion too can be prophetic, and it can also be an act of resistance. And I think that we need to paint a picture of a better country through those acts of prophetic resistance.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And there have been little notes coming in through the chat about thanking you for your clarity. And you're right, your faith-filled compassion and knowledge. So we thank you. It has been a privilege to get to know you and to invite you to share your wisdom with us. Thank you very, very much. So you're right, here comes some more coming through the chat. That way we just want you to know that we so appreciate this. So, and the next steps, you gave us some next steps. You gave us ways to think and ideas to begin to say out loud, you know, so that they're not left, you know, out of left field for people. So I thank you for that. Now, I believe next I'm going to ask Kathy if you would tell us, you know, actually our next speaker is going to be someone who really is addressing. Kathy, do you want to share that with everybody? I think it's a perfect next step for us. Go ahead, please.
Okay. Jim, would you please put up that screen that shows our coming programs? So we have 2 more webinar events this summer, and you see them here on the screen. I think Kay's talking about the next one coming up in August. We've got Zeke Hernandez, who will be here talking about his new book, The Truth About Immigration: Why Successful Societies Welcome Newcomers. He combines personal stories, including his own, he's originally from Uruguay, with research to offer a look at how newcomers affect our local communities and our nation. And then on September 17th, with the election season coming up, we will have SNL's chaplain, Father David Burstmeyer, with us. He will discuss Catholic social teaching and how it calls us to promote the common good for all of society, and how voting helps us do that. And then our final event for the summer will actually be an in-person event. On Sunday, September 29th, starting at 2:30, we will be observing the 110th International Day of Prayer for Immigrants and Refugees, starting off with a procession and then Mass at the Cathedral of the Most Blessed Sacrament on Woodward in Detroit. This will be an event for all our members, our allies, our friends. We expect people from all over the state to join us. We're hoping to have 1,000 people, and we hope you will be part of it too. With this event, we want to show the world our desire and commitment for community and diversity. And then lastly, I want to mention that on November 13th, we'll be holding our second lobby day in Lansing to continue our support of the Drive Safe bills. So you'll be receiving emails from us, our newsletter and so forth, that will be talking about all these programs, telling you how to register and participate. You can always also go to our website, strangersnolonger.org. So I hope you'll continue to be involved this summer. Thank you.
Before we go, Kathy, I just want to say Zeke Fernandez. I looked him up. I went, who is this author? He's a brilliant author. He has written very intelligent, insightful books. So
And one thing I really like is he's got a lot of ideas of how we can improve our immigration system. That's what I'd like to hear.
So, well, all right, here we are together, and we both want to thank you for joining us this evening. This has just been a privilege for us to put together, and we really want to thank Dylan again. Kathy?
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you in August.